Angela Parker's first day at St. Mary's General Hospital was marred by subtle prejudice and exclusion. Despite her best efforts, the challenges she faced seemed overwhelming. But when VIP patient Thomas Edwards arrived, everything changed. His presence would ignite a series of events that could transform the hospital's toxic culture. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. St. Mary's General Hospital stood as a symbol of medical excellence in a well-to-do suburban community, its immaculate exterior a testament to the high standards it upheld within. The hospital was a place where the privileged sought care, confident in the knowledge that they were receiving the best treatment money could buy. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect institution, there were undercurrents of tension and unspoken prejudices that only became visible when Angela Parker, a talented and determined Black nurse, joined the staff. Angela Parker had always been driven by a deep sense of purpose. Nursing was more than just a profession to her, it was a calling, a way to make a tangible difference in the lives of others. She had worked tirelessly to earn her credentials, overcoming countless obstacles along the way. And now, as she walked through the gleaming doors of St. Mary's, she felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. This was a prestigious hospital, a place where she could truly shine, but Angela had learned long ago that her presence in such spaces was often met with resistance. The hospital's interior was a study in contrasts. The floors were polished to a mirror-like finish, and the walls were adorned with soothing artwork meant to create a calm and healing environment. Yet the atmosphere felt anything but welcoming as Angela made her way to the nurses' station. There was an almost palpable tension in the air, a stiffness that seemed to permeate the very walls. Conversations that had been lively just moments before dwindled to muted murmurs, and the staff, who had been bustling about their duties, suddenly seemed preoccupied with anything but acknowledging her presence. Angela's heart sank as she noticed the subtle but unmistakable signs of discomfort that her arrival had triggered. The sideways glances, the forced smiles, the way people seemed to find excuses to busy themselves with charts or paperwork, all of it spoke volumes. She had encountered this kind of behavior before, but it never got any easier. Still, Angela was nothing if not resilient. She had faced bigger challenges than this, and she was determined not to let the cold reception shake her confidence. "Excuse me," Angela said, her voice calm and steady as she addressed a group of nurses gathered at the station. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could someone please direct me to the head nurse's office?" For a moment it seemed as though no one would respond, but finally a tall, slender nurse with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes looked up. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, surprise, perhaps, or curiosity, but it was quickly masked by a polite, professional demeanor. "Of course," the nurse replied, her tone clipped and formal. "It's down the hall. Third door on the right." "Thank you," Angela replied with a nod, her gratitude genuine despite the chilly reception. She turned and walked in the direction the nurse had indicated, feeling the weight of the stairs on her back as she moved down the corridor. The sound of her shoes against the tile floor seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet space, each step a reminder that she was an outsider here, at least for now. As Angela approached the head nurse's office, she nearly collided with a tall man in a crisp white coat who was stepping out of a nearby room. His presence was commanding, his salt and pepper hair and stern expression giving him an air of authority. This, she surmised, must be one of the senior doctors. Angela's heart quickened slightly as she saw an opportunity to make a positive first impression. "Good morning," Dr. Angela greeted him with a warm, sincere smile. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today. It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor's gray eyes flicked over her, his gaze cool and appraising. There was no warmth in his expression, only a detached professionalism that bordered on dismissiveness. "Dr. William Greaves," he introduced himself curtly. "I trust you've been properly oriented to our protocols." Angela opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say a word, Dr. Greaves continued, his tone sharp and unyielding. "We maintain very high standards here at St. Mary's. I expect you to meet them." Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Angela standing there with her hand still extended in greeting. For a moment, Angela felt the sting of the doctor's cold dismissal, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had encountered people like Dr. Greaves before, those who judged her not by her skills or her dedication, but by something as superficial as the color of her skin. She had learned to rise above such attitudes, to let her work speak for itself. With a deep breath, Angela gathered her resolve and knocked on the door to the head nurse's office. As she waited for a response, Angela's thoughts drifted back to her days in nursing school. She could still hear her mother's voice, filled with a mixture of pride and caution. offering words of wisdom that had guided her through the most challenging times. "Baby girl," her mother had said, "you're going to have to fight twice as hard as everyone else, but don't you ever let them see you sweat. You come from a long line of strong women, and you've got that same strength in you." Those words had been a source of comfort and motivation for Angela throughout her journey. She remembered the long nights spent poring over textbooks, the hours of hands-on practice in the lab, and the constant pressure to prove herself in an environment that often felt unwelcoming. She had faced skepticism from some of her professors who doubted her abilities despite her academic achievements. She had heard the whispered comments from classmates questioning whether she truly belonged, but Angela had never let those doubts take root in her heart. She had pushed herself to excel, graduating at the top of her class, her success a testament to her hard work and determination. Now, standing in the corridors of St. Mary's, Angela felt that familiar determination surge within her. She had been through worse, and she had come out stronger each time. This was just another challenge, another obstacle to overcome. She would prove herself here, just as she had before. Inside the hospital, the day wore on. Patients came and went, doctors made their rounds, and nurses tended to their duties with practiced efficiency. But there was one patient who remained, his presence a quiet but significant undercurrent to the day's events. Thomas Edwards, an older gentleman with a calm demeanor and an air of quiet authority, lay in his hospital bed, observing everything around him with a discerning eye. Mr. Edwards was not a man of many words, but there was something about him, something in the way he watched and listened that hinted at a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play within the hospital. As Angela went about her tasks, she couldn't help but notice Mr. Edwards. He was polite, even kind, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her feel as though he saw right through the facade of St. Mary's. He asked her questions about her experiences, about how she was finding her work, and while his tone was always gentle, Angela sensed that there was more to his inquiries than mere curiosity. What Angela didn't know was that Mr. Edwards was not just an ordinary patient. He was someone who wielded considerable influence, someone whose presence at St. Mary's was no accident. As he observed Angela's interactions with the staff, as he listened to the subtle undercurrents of prejudice that simmered beneath the surface, he began to formulate a plan. Mr. Edwards was a man who believed in justice, in fairness, and in the power of individuals to bring about change. And he saw in Angela Parker a kindred spirit, someone who had the strength and the determination to stand up against the injustices she faced. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. In the days that followed, tensions at St. Mary's began to mount. Conflicts that had once been hidden beneath a veneer of professionalism started to bubble to the surface. Angela found herself at the center of these tensions, her every move scrutinized, her every word weighed and measured. But she refused to be intimidated. She continued to do her job with the same level of care and compassion that had guided her throughout her career. All the while, Mr. Edwards watched, waiting for the right moment to reveal the power he held, a power that would turn the tide in Angela's favor and set in motion a chain of events that would change St. Mary's General Hospital forever. The door creaked open, and Angela's heart skipped a beat as she faced the woman standing in the doorway. She was a middle-aged woman, her graying hair pulled back into a tight bun, with a stern expression that matched her no-nonsense demeanor. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, locked onto Angela's with an intensity that made the young nurse straighten her posture instinctively. "Miss Parker, I presume," the woman said, her tone clipped and formal. Without waiting for a response, she stepped aside, gesturing for Angela to enter. "Come in. We have a lot to cover, and I expect you to keep up." Angela's nerves tingled as she stepped over the threshold, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft thud that seemed to reverberate in the silence. The head nurse led the way down a narrow corridor, her heels clicking briskly against the polished linoleum floor. Angela followed, her eyes darting around as she tried to take in her new surroundings. The walls were lined with faded posters promoting hand hygiene and patient safety, their edges curling with age. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow that made the whole place feel slightly unreal. As they walked, Angela couldn't shake the growing unease that settled in the pit of her stomach. There was something about the atmosphere in St. Mary's that felt off, as if the very air was charged with an undercurrent of tension. It was a feeling she couldn't quite put her finger on, but it made her skin prickle with unease. She had expected the usual first-day jitters, the awkwardness of being the new person. But this was something more. It was as if she had stepped into a place where the walls themselves held secrets, where every smile hid something darker beneath. Little did Angela know that her arrival at St. Mary's General Hospital would be more than just the start of a new job. It would be the beginning of a journey that would challenge her in ways she had never imagined, forcing her to confront not only the biases and prejudices of others, but also the limits of her strength and resilience. The hospital, with its pristine facade and prestigious reputation, was a battleground she hadn't anticipated, a place where silent wars were waged every day, and where her presence would soon become a catalyst for change. The rest of Angela's first day passed in a blur of activity, each moment blending into the next as she was shuffled from one orientation session to another. There were endless introductions to make, names and faces she struggled to remember, and a mountain of paperwork that seemed to grow with each passing hour. The hospital was a labyrinth of hallways and departments, each one bustling with its rhythm and energy. As she made her way through the maze, Angela couldn't help but notice the subtle ways in which she was being kept at arm's length. Conversations that were lively and animated would suddenly fall silent as she approached, only to resume in hushed whispers once she had passed by. When she tried to engage in small talk with her fellow nurses, her efforts were met with polite but distant responses, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. It was as if an invisible barrier had been erected around her, one that marked her as different, as an outsider in what should have been a collaborative and supportive environment. By the time her shift finally ended, Angela felt drained, her mind and body heavy with the weight of the day. As she gathered her belongings from her locker, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just survived a test, one that she hadn't even known she was taking. The locker room was quiet. The only sound was the soft rustle of clothing as other nurses prepared to leave for the day. Angela was about to close her locker when she heard voices coming from around the corner, low and conspiratorial. "Did you see the new hire?" one voice whispered, the words dripping with disdain. "Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking," the other replied, equally dismissive. "This isn't exactly the neighborhood for, you know." The sentence trailed off, but the implication was clear. Angela's hand froze on her locker door, her heart sinking as the meaning of their words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had hoped that the coldness she had felt was just first-day nerves, that it was something that would pass with time. But now, the reality of her situation was becoming painfully clear. This wasn't just a new job, it was going to be a daily battle against prejudice and preconceptions, a fight she hadn't anticipated, but one she would have to face head-on. As she left the hospital that evening, the weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement as Angela made her way to the bus stop. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: disappointment, anger, frustration, but most of all, a deep, gnawing sense of doubt. The excitement and anticipation she had felt that morning had been replaced by a heavy feeling of isolation, as if she were adrift in a sea of indifference. Sitting on the hard plastic bench at the bus stop, Angela pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed a familiar number. After 2 rings, a warm, comforting voice answered, and the tension in Angela's chest began to loosen. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" Her mother's voice was like a balm to her frayed nerves, wrapping her in the warmth of familiarity and love. Angela felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to break down in public. "It was challenging, Mama," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The word felt inadequate, but it was all she could manage without her voice cracking. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Angela could almost picture her mother's face, the way her brows would furrow in concern. "Angela Marie Parker, you listen to me," her mother said, her voice firm but gentle. "You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are and where you come from. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of being in those halls one day." Angela closed her eyes, letting her mother's words sink in, grounding her in the strength of her heritage and the love of her family. "I know, Mama. It's just that I didn't expect it to be this hard." "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, baby," her mother replied, her voice softening with understanding. "But you've got the strength of generations behind you. Hold your head high, do your job better than anyone else, and don't you dare let them see you falter. You hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Angela said, her resolve hardening with each word. "I hear you." As she ended the call, Angela's eyes caught a movement out of the corner of her eye. A sleek black Mercedes had slowed down as it passed the bus stop, its tinted windows concealing the occupants. But in that brief moment, Angela caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves, the hospital's chief of surgery. Their eyes met for a fleeting second before the car sped away, leaving Angela with a lingering sense of unease. Squaring her shoulders, Angela reminded herself of her mother's words. She may be facing an uphill battle, but she was far from alone. With the strength of her family behind her and her determination to prove herself, Angela knew she could weather whatever challenges St. Mary's threw her way. The bus rumbled into view, and as it pulled up to the stop, Angela stood, her resolve firm. As she boarded the bus and took a seat by the window, Angela gazed out at the fading light, her mind already turning to the next day. Little did she know that her presence at St. Mary's was about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the very foundations of the hospital's culture. The coming weeks would unfold like a slow-burning fuse, with each day adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. The initial coolness she had encountered was just the tip of the iceberg, masking a deeper, more insidious form of exclusion that would force Angela to confront the toxic undercurrents that flowed through the hospital issue. But Angela was ready. She had to be. The battle lines were drawn, and she was determined not only to survive but to make her mark on St. Mary's, no matter the cost. As Angela made her morning rounds through the bustling hospital corridors, she couldn't help but notice the glaring disparity in how she was treated compared to her white colleagues. The difference wasn't just in the occasional cold shoulder or curt response, it was in the way certain individuals, particularly Dr. William Greaves, seemed to go out of their way to undermine her. Despite her dedication and unwavering commitment to her work, Dr. Greaves appeared to derive a perverse satisfaction from finding fault with her efforts, no matter how meticulously she performed her duties. One crisp morning, as the early light streamed through the hospital windows, Dr. Greaves' voice rang out sharply, cutting through the usual hum of activity at the nurse's station. "Nurse Parker," he called, his tone laced with an edge that instantly drew the attention of those nearby. Angela turned to face him, her heart beating a little faster, though she outwardly remained composed. "I hope you've familiarized yourself with our protocols by now," he continued, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "We can't afford any mistakes." The way he enunciated the word mistakes made it clear that he wasn't speaking in general terms, he was speaking directly to her. The implied threat in his words sent a chill down Angela's spine, but she met his gaze without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her intimidated. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Of course, Dr. Greaves. "I assure you I'm fully versed in all hospital procedures," she replied, her voice steady and confident. But instead of acknowledging her professionalism, Dr. Greaves simply raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "We'll see about that, won't we?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Let's hope you've learned everything you need to hear." His words hung in the air long after he turned and walked away, leaving Angela to face the silent, knowing glances of her colleagues. The other nurses, who had pretended to be absorbed in their tasks, were eavesdropping, their feigned indifference only adding to Angela's sense of isolation. She could feel the weight of unspoken judgments pressing down on her, a constant reminder that she was being watched more closely than anyone else. Throughout the day, this scrutiny manifested in the assignments she was given. While her white colleagues were often handed straightforward cases, Angela found herself repeatedly tasked with the most challenging and undesirable duties. It was as if someone was deliberately testing her limits, seeing how much she could handle before she broke. One such assignment came in the form of Mr. Johnson, a notoriously difficult patient known for his abrasive demeanor and unabashed racism. "Angela, would you mind taking Mr. Johnson to room 305? A fellow nurse asked, her voice overly sweet, as if trying to mask the unpleasant nature of the request. Angela knew the tone all too well. It was the sound of someone passing off a task they didn't want to handle themselves. "He's been a bit challenging today." Challenging, Angela thought, was a gross understatement. Mr. Johnson had already driven 2 nurses to tears that week with his racist outbursts and vitriolic rants. But Angela nodded without hesitation, aware that refusing would only fuel the narrative that she was somehow less capable. She approached the task with the same unwavering professionalism she brought to every aspect of her job, determined to prove her worth yet again. As she entered Mr. Johnson's room, she braced herself for the inevitable tirade, wondering if this was just another way to test her resolve or worse, to set her up for failure. The moment Mr. Johnson saw her, his expression twisted into one of disgust. "What are you doing here?" he spat, his voice thick with hostility. "I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Angela took a deep breath, steeling herself against the venom in his words. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "I assure you, I'm more than qualified to provide your care." She moved methodically through her tasks, her hands steady despite the storm of racial slurs and insults that battered her senses. She focused on the job at hand, refusing to let Mr. Johnson's bigotry affect the quality of her work. Each action was deliberate, each movement precise, as she maintained her composure in the face of his relentless hatred. When she finally emerged from the room, the emotional toll of the encounter weighed heavily on her. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. Standing in the hallway, as if waiting for her, was Dr. Greaves, his expression one of feigned concern. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker?" he asked, his voice oozing insincerity. "We heard quite a commotion." Angela met his gaze evenly, refusing to let him see any cracks in her armor. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Greaves?" she replied, her tone professional yet firm. For a brief moment, a flicker of surprise crossed the doctor's face, as if he hadn't expected her to handle the situation so smoothly. But the surprise quickly gave way to his usual mask of condescension. "Well, let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients," he said, his words laden with the unspoken threat of scrutiny. "We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we?" As Dr. Greaves walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been subjected to some sort of twisted test, one that she should never have had to endure. The remainder of her shift passed in a blur of relentless tasks and subtle slights, each one reinforcing the reality that she was held to a higher standard than her peers. She found herself constantly double-checking her work, not because she doubted her abilities, but because she knew that any mistake, no matter how small, would be magnified and used against her. As the hours dragged on, Angela found herself increasingly aware of the stark contrast between her own experience and that of her white colleagues. They moved through their shifts with an ease that she envied, their laughter and light-hearted conversations a sharp counterpoint to the burden she bore. Each task she completed felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the hospital itself was pressing down on her. The inequality in their workloads was blatant, yet it remained the unspoken norm at St. Mary's. Every time Angela considered voicing her concerns, a familiar voice echoed in her mind, her mother's stern yet loving reminder, "Don't you dare let them see you falter." By the time her shift ended, Angela felt utterly depleted, both physically and emotionally. She moved slowly as she gathered her things from her locker, her body aching from the demands of the day. The exhaustion went beyond the physical. It was the kind of weariness that seeped into her bones, making even the simplest actions feel insurmountable. As she stood there fumbling with her locker door, she couldn't help but overhear two nurses whispering nearby. Their voices were low, but the venom in their words was unmistakable. "Can you believe they're making such a big deal about diversity hires?" One of them sneered, her tone laced with disdain. "It's not like they can keep up with the rest of us anyway." Angela's hand froze on the locker door, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, leaving her momentarily stunned. A rush of anger surged through her, mingling with a deep-seated hurt. Every fiber of her being wanted to turn around, to confront them and defend herself, to prove that she was every bit as capable as they were. But she knew that any such confrontation would only serve to confirm their prejudices, giving them more ammunition to use against her. So, with a resolve born of years of facing similar slights, Angela closed her locker quietly and walked out of the hospital, her head held high even as the weight of the day threatened to crush her spirit. As she waited at the bus stop, Angela's mind replayed the events of the day, each moment compounding her sense of isolation. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the familiar sleek black Mercedes pulling up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Dr. Greaves behind the wheel, his expression as smug as ever. "Nurse Parker," he called out, his voice oozing with feigned concern, waiting for the bus again. "Such a shame. Looks like that's all you can afford on a nurse's salary, isn't it?" The words were delivered with the same casual cruelty she had come to expect from him, and they cut deep, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Before Angela could muster a response, Dr. Greaves sped away, leaving her standing there in a haze of humiliation and fury. The bitterness of the encounter lingered long after the car had disappeared from view, a stark reminder of the uphill battle she faced every day at St. Mary's. As she finally boarded the bus, Angela's thoughts were a chaotic swirl of emotions. The hope and excitement that had filled her when she first started at the hospital seemed like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the harsh realities of her day-to-day existence. Yet beneath the anger and hurt, there was a simmering resolve and determination to endure, no matter how difficult the path ahead. As the bus rumbled through the darkening streets, Angela found herself grappling with an unsettling question: how much longer could she continue like this? The pressure was relentless, and she could feel it slowly wearing her down. But even as doubts gnawed at her, a small, insistent voice in the back of her mind whispered that change was possible. The question was not whether something would give, but what or who would be the catalyst for that change. Would it be her, standing up and demanding the respect she deserved? Or would someone else step in, someone with the power to challenge the toxic culture that had taken root at St. Mary's? Little did Angela know, an unexpected ally was about to enter her life, someone who would help tip the scales in her favor and bring to light the deep-seated prejudices that had long festered within the walls of St. Mary's General Hospital. As she closed her eyes and leaned back against the bus seat, she drew strength from the memory of her mother's words and the legacy of resilience that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. Tomorrow would bring another battle, but Angela was determined to face it head-on, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The next morning, Angela arrived at St. Mary's with a renewed sense of purpose. The night had given her time to reflect on her experiences, to remind herself of why she had chosen this path in the first place. Nursing was more than just a job to her, it was a calling, a way to make a difference in people's lives, regardless of the obstacles she faced. As she walked through the hospital's familiar halls, she noticed an unusual buzz of activity around the nurses' station. There was an energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that she hadn't felt in a long time. "What's going on?" Angela asked one of her colleagues, her curiosity piqued by the flurry of movement. The nurse, caught up in the excitement, momentarily dropped her usual aloofness. "We've got a VIP patient coming in," she replied, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Some big shot who got into a skiing accident. Both arms are broken, from what I heard." Before Angela could ask for more details, Dr. Greaves appeared, his face set in its usual stern expression. "Nurse Parker, enter," he said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "I need you to handle the new admission in room 412. Mr. Thomas Edwards. He's had a severe skiing accident, and both his arms are broken. I expect you to provide him with the utmost care and attention." Angela nodded, recognizing the assignment for what it was: another test, another opportunity for Dr. Greaves to push her to her limits. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'll see to it right away." As she made her way to room 412, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this assignment. The air of importance surrounding this patient made her wonder if there was more to this situation than met the eye. Entering the room, she was greeted by the sight of a middle-aged man lying in bed, both arms encased in casts. Despite his injuries, there was an undeniable aura of authority about him, a quiet confidence that set him apart from the other patients she had treated. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela said, approaching the bed with a warm smile. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay with us." As she spoke, Angela felt a strange sense of anticipation, as though this moment marked the beginning of something significant. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a feeling in the air, a sense that the tides were about to turn. Whether that change would be for better or worse, she couldn't yet say. But one thing was certain: Angela was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the strength and resilience that had carried her this far. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Mr. Edwards looked up at Angela with eyes that were sharp and assessing, a contrast to the frail appearance that came with his condition. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," he greeted her, his voice carrying a strength that belied his circumstances. "I appreciate your help. I must admit, I didn't foresee ending up here after my skiing accident." As Angela began her routine of checking his vitals and assessing his condition, she couldn't help but notice the intensity with which Mr. Edwards observed her every move. Unlike many of the patients she had encountered, there was no trace of prejudice or condescension in his gaze. Instead, there was a thoughtful curiosity, as if he were carefully weighing everything he saw. "You seem very competent, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards commented as she adjusted the flow of his IV with practiced precision. His tone was sincere, lacking the patronizing edge that so often accompanied such remarks from others. "How long have you been working at St. Mary's?" Angela paused, momentarily caught off guard by his genuine interest. Most patients didn't ask about her, or if they did, it was out of idle curiosity rather than true concern. "I've been here for a few weeks now, sir," she replied cautiously, aware that her words would be carefully scrutinized. "It's been quite an experience so far." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes at her diplomatic response. "I see," he said thoughtfully, his voice carrying a subtle undertone that suggested he understood more than he let on. "And how have you found it?" "I trust the hospital is living up to its prestigious reputation." Angela hesitated, the weight of the question heavy in the air. Before she could formulate a response, the door swung open and Dr. Greaves entered the room with an exuberance that was entirely uncharacteristic of him. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves exclaimed, his voice dripping with an effusiveness that Angela had never heard before. "I trust Nurse Parker has been taking excellent care of you." His words, though intended to flatter, rang hollow in Angela's ears. The implication that she had been specially assigned to Mr. Edwards, one of their most distinguished patients, was a far cry from the reality she had experienced. Angela worked hard to keep her expression neutral, knowing all too well that Dr. Greaves had never shown any particular confidence in her abilities until now. But Mr. Edwards seemed to pick up on the discrepancy, his sharp eyes flicking between the doctor and the nurse. "Indeed, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his voice measured and deliberate. "Nurse Parker has been exemplary. I was just asking her about her experiences here at St. Mary's." His statement was casual, but there was a probing quality to it, as though he were testing the waters. For a brief moment, Dr. Greaves' polished smile faltered, but he quickly recovered, his demeanor shifting back to its usual facade of warmth. "Well, I'm sure she'll tell you it's been nothing short of excellent. We pride ourselves on our inclusive and supportive environment here at St. Mary's," he said, his words heavy with the kind of corporate speak that Angela had come to detest. Angela felt a surge of anger at Dr. Greaves' blatant hypocrisy, the familiar sense of injustice tightening in her chest. Yet she maintained her professional demeanor, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his words affected her. Mr. Edwards, however, seemed to sense the tension beneath the surface. "Is that so?" he mused, his gaze never leaving Angela's face. "Well, I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand during my stay." As Dr. Greaves launched into an overly detailed explanation of Mr. Edwards' treatment plan, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something significant. There was something in the way Mr. Edwards had looked at her, in the pointed nature of his questions, that suggested he was not easily fooled by appearances. It was as though he saw past the polished exterior of St. Mary's and into the underlying truth of the situation. Over the following days, Angela found herself spending more time in Mr. Edwards' room than with any other patient. Despite his injuries, he remained alert and engaged, often striking up conversations that were as insightful as they were unexpected. He asked her about her work, her background, and the challenges she faced. Unlike so many others, Mr. Edwards listened intently, never interrupting or dismissing her concerns. There was no hint of the prejudice she had come to expect, only a genuine interest that left her both intrigued and slightly wary. One afternoon, as Angela was carefully changing Mr. Edwards' bandages, she overheard a conversation just outside the room that made her blood run cold. "I don't care what Dr. Greaves says," hissed a voice that Angela recognized as one of her colleagues. "I don't trust that Parker woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do?" "I know," another voice replied, equally venomous, "but we can't say anything. They'll just accuse us of being racist." Angela's hands trembled slightly as she finished her task, the weight of their words pressing down on her like a physical burden. The constant suspicion, the relentless scrutiny, it was more than she could bear some days. She tried to steady herself, focusing on the task at hand, but it was difficult to ignore the insidious whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. Mr. Edwards, ever observant, noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the tension in her expression. "Is everything all right, Nurse Parker?" he asked, his voice gentle but laced with concern. Angela forced a smile, trying to keep her emotions in check. "Of course, Mr. Edwards," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her, "just concentrating on getting these bandages just right." Mr. Edwards was silent for a moment, his eyes studying her face with a depth of understanding that caught Angela off guard. "You know," he said finally, his tone thoughtful, I've always believed that a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those they perceive as beneath them." Angela looked up, startled by the unexpected insight of his comment. It was as if Mr. Edwards could see right through the superficial interactions and into the heart of the matter. He held her gaze, a knowing look in his eyes. "I've seen a lot in my time, Nurse Parker," he continued, his voice soft but firm. "And I can tell you, the view from this bed has been illuminating." Before Angela could respond, Dr. Greaves entered the room, his arrival abruptly ending their conversation. As she left the room, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Edwards was far more than just a VIP patient. His words and actions hinted at a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play in St. Mary's, and for the first time since she had started working there, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. It was as though Mr. Edwards had recognized something in her, a strength, a resolve, and was subtly encouraging her to hold on to it. What Angela didn't realize was that Mr. Edwards' presence at St. Mary's was about to set in motion a series of events that would shake the hospital to its very core. His seemingly casual remarks, his keen observations, and his quiet support of Angela were all part of a larger plan. In the coming days, the true nature of St. Mary's General Hospital would be exposed, and the deep-seated prejudices that had long festered beneath its pristine surface would be brought into the light. As the days stretched into weeks, Angela felt the weight of isolation settle heavily on her shoulders at St. Mary's. What had begun as a frosty reception from her colleagues had now escalated into overt hostility, manifesting in whispered comments that seemed to follow her like a shadow and pointed glares that bore into her back whenever she walked by. The tension was palpable, a constant reminder that she was unwelcome in this place that should have been a bastion of healing and care. Dr. Greaves, sensing the lack of repercussions for his earlier subtle undermining, grew bolder in his attempts to make Angela's life difficult. It seemed he took particular satisfaction in watching her struggle, a cruel game that he played with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. One morning, as Angela was diligently reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station, Dr. Greaves approached her with a stack of files so thick that it made her heart sink just to look at them. "Nurse Parker," he said, his tone oozing with a mock concern that barely masked his true intentions, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly challenging. I trust you're up to the task." His words were laden with an unspoken dare, as if he were testing her resolve, waiting for any sign of weakness. Angela glanced at the stack of files he had placed in front of her, her eyes quickly assessing the situation. It didn't take long to realize that this was nearly double the workload of her colleagues. It was an impossible task, designed to push her to her limits. But instead of letting the intimidation show, she met Dr. Greaves's gaze with unwavering steadiness. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied calmly, her voice betraying none of the anxiety that churned in her stomach. "I'll see to it right away." As Dr. Greaves turned to leave, a smug smirk played at the corners of his mouth, and Angela caught his whispered words as he walked away. "Let's see how she handles this." His parting shot lingered in the air, a bitter taunt that Angela had no choice but to ignore. The rest of the day became a blur of relentless activity as Angela found herself running from one challenging case to another, with barely a moment to catch her breath. The patients assigned to her were among the most difficult in the hospital, some with complex medical needs that required meticulous attention, others with challenging personalities that tested even the most patient of nurses. It was as if the hospital itself had conspired to break her, to see how much she could endure before she finally cracked under the pressure. Despite the overwhelming workload, Angela refused to let her standards slip. She approached each patient with the same level of care and professionalism that she had prided herself on since the start of her career. Every interaction and every procedure was performed with meticulous precision, even as exhaustion began to claw at the edges of her focus. But as the hours dragged on, the relentless pace began to take its toll. Her muscles ached from constant movement, her mind reeled from the unending demands, and her heart felt heavy with the knowledge that no matter how hard she tried, it would never be enough to win over those who had already judged her. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As she hurried to respond to yet another call light, Angela overheard 2 of her colleagues whispering nearby. Their voices were low, but the words carried a sting that cut through the haze of her fatigue. "Can you believe they're letting her handle all these critical cases?" one nurse said, her voice thick with disdain. The contempt in her tone was unmistakable, a reflection of the animosity that had become commonplace. "It's like they're just waiting for her to mess up," the other nurse replied, though there was a grudging note of admiration in her voice. "But you have to admit, it's impressive how she keeps going. I would have cracked by now." Angela felt a wave of anger and hurt wash over her, a toxic mix of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. The realization that her colleagues not only recognized the unfair treatment she was receiving, but were also passively watching to see if she would fail was almost more than she could bear. It was as if they were spectators at a cruel sport, waiting for the moment when she would finally falter, when they could point and say, "I told you so." As the day dragged on, Angela found herself making more frequent trips to Mr. Edwards's room. Unlike the rest of the hospital, his room had become a refuge, a sanctuary where the relentless demands and hostile stares couldn't reach her. Mr. Edwards, a kindly older man with a sharp wit and a warm smile, seemed to sense the turmoil Angela was going through, and his presence was a balm to her frayed nerves. Nurse Parker, Mr. Edwards, greeted her with a gentle smile as she entered his room for a routine check. His voice was soft, filled with a warmth that Angela had found nowhere else in the hospital. "You look exhausted. Is everything all right?" Angela managed a weak smile in return, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a busy day, Mr. Edwards," she replied, her voice tinged with weariness but still carrying that note of professionalism she clung to so desperately. "Nothing I can't handle." But even as she spoke the words, Angela felt the weight of the day bearing down on her, the emotional and physical strain of her workload pressing harder with each passing hour. Mr. Edwards' room might have been a temporary escape, but it couldn't shield her from the reality waiting just outside the door, a reality where she was constantly tested, constantly pushed, and constantly reminded that she was an outsider in this unforgiving world. Yet, despite it all, Angela knew she couldn't afford to give up. The battle was far from over, and she was determined to fight it to the end, no matter the cost. Mr. Edwards studied her face for a long moment, his eyes reflecting genuine concern as he observed the exhaustion etched into her features. "You know," he began slowly, choosing his words with care, "there's a significant difference between merely handling something and truly thriving in it. From everything I've seen, you're more than capable of the latter." His voice was gentle but firm, the kind that encouraged without demanding. Angela appreciated his words, but they also served as a painful reminder of the stark contrast between Mr. Edwards's kindness and the cold indifference or outright hostility she often faced from the rest of the hospital staff. She felt a lump form in her throat, the familiar weight of her isolation threatening to overwhelm her. Despite the kind intentions behind Mr. Edwards's statement, it highlighted just how isolated she truly was in this environment. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she managed to reply, her voice barely more than a whisper as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. "I appreciate your kindness." She turned to leave, eager to escape before her composure cracked, but Mr. Edwards called out to her once more. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made her pause mid-step. "Remember, sometimes the greatest strength lies not in enduring, but in knowing when to speak up." His words lingered in the air, filled with a subtle but profound wisdom that left Angela momentarily stunned. As Angela left the room, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one spinning faster than the last. The implications of Mr. Edwards's advice weighed heavily on her as she made her way back to the nurse's station. Was he suggesting that she should confront the injustices she faced, or was it merely a general piece of advice? Either way, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to change. She just didn't know how soon that change would come, or how unprepared she was for what lay ahead. The following morning, Angela arrived at the hospital to find an unusual atmosphere gripping the staff. The air was thick with tension, and there was a noticeable buzz of heightened activity. It didn't take long for her to overhear the rumors swirling through the corridors. An emergency operation of critical importance was scheduled for later that day, and the hospital's board members, along with several other influential visitors, were expected to observe. The stakes were high, and everyone seemed acutely aware of it. As Angela began her morning rounds, she couldn't help but notice the nervous energy that permeated the hospital. Nurses and doctors alike were on edge, their anxiety palpable as they moved about with a sense of urgency that was almost contagious. The pressure of the upcoming operation hung over everyone like a dark cloud, and Angela found herself wondering if today would be the day that everything changed. Midway through her duties, Dr. Greaves approached Angela with an expression that immediately put her on alert. There was a glint in his eye that she couldn't quite place, something that made her instinctively wary. "Nurse Parker." He said, his voice carefully neutral but carrying an undertone that set her on edge. "We need you to assist in the emergency operation this afternoon. It's a critical case, and I trust you're prepared to handle it." A mixture of surprise and suspicion surged through Angela. Being asked to assist in such a high-profile operation was usually considered an honor, a recognition of skill and reliability. But coming from Dr. Greaves, the request felt more like a setup. She couldn't help but wonder if there was an ulterior motive behind it. Was this another one of his twisted tests, designed to push her to the breaking point? "Of course, Dr. Greaves," Angela replied, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I'll be ready." As Dr. Greaves walked away, she overheard him muttering to another doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." The words sent a shiver down her spine, reinforcing her suspicion that this was no ordinary assignment. The hours leading up to the operation were a blur of intense preparation and mounting anticipation. Angela threw herself into her work with a determination that bordered on obsession, double and triple checking everything to ensure that she was as prepared as possible for whatever challenges might arise during the surgery. She knew that any mistake, no matter how minor, would not only reflect poorly on her but could also be used as ammunition by those who seemed intent on undermining her. When the time came to scrub in for the surgery, Angela couldn't ignore the skeptical looks she received from some of the other staff members. Their doubt was almost palpable, an unspoken question hanging in the air: could she handle the pressure? Angela took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, a mantra she had repeated to herself countless times: "Don't you dare let them see you falter." The operation began, and the tension in the room was almost suffocating. Angela found herself working alongside Dr. Greaves and several other senior staff members, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on her. The knowledge that important observers were watching their every move added an extra layer of pressure, making each decision and each action feel even more critical. Despite the intense atmosphere, Angela remained focused, her movements precise and efficient. Years of training and experience guided her hands as she anticipated the needs of the surgeons, often handing them instruments before they even had to ask. But as the operation progressed, Angela noticed something that made her heart race with fear. Dr. Greaves, who was usually so confident and sure, seemed to be hesitating. His hands, normally steady as a rock, trembled slightly as he prepared to make a critical incision. In that split second, Angela realized with growing horror that Dr. Greaves was about to make a potentially life-threatening mistake. Without a moment's hesitation, Angela spoke up, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "Dr. Greaves," she said, her tone clear and steady despite the fear gripping her insides, "perhaps we should consider approaching from a different angle. The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer." Her words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in a suggestion. All eyes in the room turned to Dr. Greaves, waiting to see how he would respond. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The room fell into a heavy silence, tension thickening the air as every eye in the operating room turned to Angela. Dr. Greaves, who had been barking orders with his usual air of superiority, suddenly paused, his gaze snapping to her. For a brief moment, Angela braced herself for his rebuke, expecting him to dismiss her suggestion without a second thought. His expression flickered with a mix of surprise and anger, the kind of look that usually preceded a sharp reprimand. But then, in a move that stunned everyone, Dr. Greaves gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. Reluctantly, he adjusted his approach, following Angela's advice. As the surgery continued, it became increasingly clear that her intervention had likely saved the patient's life. When the operation finally concluded, a wave of relief washed over the entire team, but Angela could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The eyes of her colleagues bore into her, some filled with newfound respect, others simmering with resentment. Dr. Greaves, in particular, seemed to seethe with barely contained rage, his anger palpable even in the sterile air of the operating room. The tension between them crackled like electricity as the team began to clean up. Without warning, Dr. Greaves turned to Angela, his voice low and menacing. "Nurse Parker, I need to see you in private immediately." Angela followed him out of the operating room, her heart pounding in her chest. The corridor seemed longer than usual, each step echoing with the weight of what had just transpired. She knew that speaking up had been the right thing to do her duty as a nurse and a professional, but she also understood the risk she had taken. Dr. Greaves was not a man who easily tolerated dissent, and Angela feared that her decision might have just cost her the job she had worked so hard to secure. Her thoughts raced as they entered a small, private room, only for Angela to realize with a jolt of surprise that they had walked into Mr. Edwards' room. In the heat of the moment, she had forgotten that he was still a patient at the hospital. But Dr. Greaves, his face twisted with anger, seemed too furious to care. As soon as the door clicked shut behind them, Dr. Greaves spun around, his face flushed red with fury. His voice was a venomous hiss as he spoke. "How dare you question my judgment in there?" His words dripped with contempt. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't have you fired on the spot for such insubordination." Angela felt her pulse quicken, but she stood her ground, her voice calm yet resolute. "Dr. Greaves, I was simply doing my job," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Your job," Dr. Greaves shot back, his voice rising with each word. "Your job is to follow orders, not to think you know better than your superiors. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious institution like St. Mary's. You're here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real skill or knowledge." As Dr. Greaves' tirade grew more vicious, his words laced with racism and hostility, Angela felt a storm of emotions welling up inside her: anger, despair, disbelief. She had endured countless slights and microaggressions during her time at St. Mary's, but this blatant display of prejudice felt like a breaking point. Just as she was about to respond, to defend herself against his baseless accusations, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said, his voice firm and laced with authority, "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Both Angela and Dr. Greaves turned, startled by the unexpected interruption. Mr. Edwards, who had been lying quietly in his bed, was now sitting up, his expression one of controlled anger. The room seemed to shift around him, the air growing thick with the undeniable power he exuded. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves stammered, the color draining from his face as he realized his grave mistake. I didn't realize you were awake. I apologize for disturbing you." "Oh, I'm very much awake, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his voice dangerously calm. "And I've been awake for quite some time, long enough to observe the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have been treating Nurse Parker." Angela stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. Mr. Edwards, who had seemed so unassuming before, now radiated an aura of authority that filled the room. It was as if he had suddenly transformed into someone else entirely, someone whose presence demanded respect and commanded attention. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to regain his composure, "I assure you there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding, Mr. Edwards," cut him off sharply, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "What I've witnessed during my stay here is a clear pattern of discrimination and harassment, and it ends now." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. As Mr. Edwards spoke, Angela could see the realization dawning on Dr. Greaves' face. This was no ordinary patient. The way Mr. Edwards carried himself, the authority in his voice, it was clear that he wielded significant power, far beyond what any of them had initially assumed. "Who are you?" Dr. Greaves asked, his earlier bravado completely evaporating, replaced by a mix of fear and confusion. The room fell silent once more, the weight of Mr. Edwards' unspoken answers settling over them all like a shroud. Angela could feel the tension in the air, the palpable shift in the dynamics of power within the room. Whatever happened next, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again at St. Mary's. Mr. Edwards smiled, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth or kindness. "I am someone who has the power to influence the future of this hospital, either for better or for worse. And right now, Dr. Greaves, I must say I am not inclined to support an institution that tolerates such blatant racism and unprofessional behavior among its staff." As the weight of his words settled over the room, Angela felt a surge of conflicting emotions washing over her. There was a profound sense of relief that someone in a position of authority had finally recognized and acknowledged the mistreatment she had been subjected to for so long. At the same time, anger simmered within her, a righteous fury at the injustice she had quietly endured. Yet, amid these emotions, a flicker of hope began to grow, hope that maybe, Just maybe things were about to change. Little did any of them know that this seemingly ordinary confrontation would ignite a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of St. Mary's General Hospital, unearthing deep-seated prejudices and sparking a long overdue reckoning. The tension in Mr. Edwards' private hospital room was almost suffocating as the full impact of his statement began to dawn on everyone present. Dr. Greaves, who had been standing confidently just moments before, now looked as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath him. His face had gone pale, and he struggled to regain his composure, his mind racing to find the right response. Angela stood in silence, her thoughts swirling as she tried to process the sudden and dramatic turn of events that had just unfolded before her eyes. Mr. Edwards, now fully upright in his hospital bed, fixed Dr. Greaves with an unwavering, penetrating gaze. His eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed nothing of the man's thoughts beyond his evident displeasure. "I believe it's time we had an open and honest conversation about the culture within this hospital. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Greaves?" Mr. Edwards' voice was calm, but the underlying challenge was unmistakable. Before Dr. Greaves could muster a response, a knock on the door interrupted the charged silence. A nurse, visibly anxious, cautiously opened the door and peeked inside. "Dr. Greaves," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "the hospital administrator needs to see you. It's urgent." Dr. Greaves glanced between Mr. Edwards and the nurse, clearly torn. His expression was one of barely concealed frustration as he attempted to navigate the unexpected crisis. After a brief hesitation, he gave a stiff nod. "We will continue this conversation at a later time, Mr. Edwards," he said, his tone curt and strained. Turning to Angela, he added, "Nurse Parker, you are dismissed for now." With that, Dr. Greaves hurriedly exited the room, leaving Angela alone with Mr. Edwards. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken thoughts and emotions, as the two of them regarded each other in the suddenly intimate setting. "Nurse Parker, Mr. Edwards finally broke the silence, his tone softening considerably. "I believe it's time I introduced myself properly. My name is Thomas Edwards, and I am the CEO of Healthcare United, one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country." Angela's eyes widened in disbelief. Healthcare United was a giant in the medical industry, a company whose influence and resources were nearly unparalleled. In that moment, everything Mr. Edwards had said earlier about his power to shape the hospital's future came into sharp focus. "Mr. Edwards, I don't know what to say," Angela stammered, her mind reeling. "Please take a seat," Mr. Edwards said, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. "We have much to discuss." For the next hour, Mr. Edwards spoke candidly about his experiences at St. Mary's. His stay at the hospital, initially unintended due to an unfortunate skiing accident, had inadvertently revealed to him the deep and troubling issues plaguing the institution. "When I came here, I expected nothing more than competent medical care," Mr. Edwards began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "But what I found was a toxic culture riddled with discrimination and unprofessionalism, things that go against everything I stand for as a leader in healthcare." If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know so on. Thank you for your valuable time. He detailed how he had witnessed, with increasing alarm, the subtle and overt forms of discrimination that Angela had faced. The microaggressions, the dismissive attitudes, and the overall toxic environment had not gone unnoticed by him. "Your experiences, Nurse Parker, are part of a larger, more disturbing pattern," Mr. Edwards continued, his voice now tinged with both anger and resolve. "But let me be clear, such behavior is completely unacceptable, and it will end here and now." As the conversation unfolded, Angela felt an overwhelming sense of validation and relief. For the first time since she had started working at St. Mary's, she felt genuinely heard and seen. Mr. Edwards listened attentively as she recounted her experiences, his expression growing more serious with each new revelation. "Thank you for your honesty, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said when she finally finished. "Your resilience in the face of such adversity is admirable. However, it's clear that what we need is not just individual strength, but systemic change." At that moment, another knock on the door broke the intensity of their exchange. The hospital administrator entered, looking visibly flustered, his eyes darting nervously between Angela and Mr. Edwards. "Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice tinged with an unmistakable quiver as she struggled to maintain her composure. "I understand that there has been some concern regarding our hospital's practices. I want to assure you that we take these matters with the utmost seriousness." Mr. Edwards, his expression unreadable but his gaze sharp, arched an eyebrow. Do you? Because from what I've seen, the only thing that seems to be taken seriously around here is the preservation of an outdated and discriminatory status quo. The hospital administrator visibly paled, caught off guard by the bluntness of his words. She hesitated before responding, clearly unprepared for such direct and pointed criticism. I'm not sure I understand. We have diversity initiatives in place to address these very concerns. Initiatives, Mr. Edwards interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Initiatives are not enough. What you need is a complete overhaul of your hospital's culture, and that change has to start at the very top. For the next several hours, Mr. Edwards meticulously outlined his demands for change. He called for a comprehensive investigation into the discriminatory practices that had long plagued St. Mary's, insisted on mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and advocated for a thorough revamping of the hospital's hiring and promotion processes. His voice hardened when he brought up Dr. Greaves, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I expect his behavior to be thoroughly investigated. His actions today were not just unprofessional, they were discriminatory and could have dangerously compromised patient care. The administrator, now fully grasping the gravity of the situation, nodded, her face drained of color. Of course, Mr. Edwards. As the day wore on, news of Mr. Edwards' true identity and his forceful demands for change spread like wildfire through St. Mary's General Hospital, creating an atmosphere of electric anticipation mixed with deep-seated unease. Angela Parker, who found herself at the very center of this unfolding drama, noticed that colleagues who had once ignored or belittled her were now approaching her with a newfound respect. Some awkwardly offered apologies for their previous behavior, while others sought her insight on the sweeping changes that were evidently on the horizon. As her shift drew to a close, Angela made her way to Mr. Edwards' room one last time. She found him sitting up in bed, looking both tired and content, as if a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Nurse Parker, he greeted her warmly, a smile spreading across his face. I hope you don't mind, but I've recommended you for a position on the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your experiences and insights will be invaluable as we work to transform St. Mary's. Angela felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in a long time. Thank you, Mr. Edwards, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Edwards shook his head slightly. No, thank you. Nurse Parker, your courage and professionalism in the face of adversity have been nothing short of inspiring. You've reminded me of why I entered the healthcare field in the first place, to make a real difference in people's lives. As Angela left the hospital that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that a new chapter was beginning, not just for her, but for St. Mary's as a whole. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but for the first time since she had started working there, Angela felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Little did she realize that the changes set in motion that day would ripple far beyond the walls of St. Mary's, affecting the entire healthcare industry. The story of a dedicated nurse and an unexpectedly influential patient was on the verge of becoming a powerful catalyst for widespread change on a scale neither could have imagined. The following days were a whirlwind of activity, tension, and emotion. The revelation of Mr. Edwards' true identity and his uncompromising demands had sent shockwaves through the hospital. The once impenetrable facade of St. Mary's had cracked, revealing deep-seated issues that had long been buried. Early on Monday morning, Angela arrived at work to find news vans parked outside and reporters jostling for statements from anyone who would speak to them. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension as staff members huddled in small groups, whispering frantically about the unfolding situation. As Angela made her way to the nurses' station, she spotted Dr. Greaves being escorted to the administration offices by hospital security. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment, Angela saw a tumultuous mix of anger, fear, and something else, perhaps a dawning realization before he was led away. Angela, a voice called out, breaking her thoughts. She turned to see Sarah, one of the nurses who had always been somewhat cold towards her, approaching with an awkward, almost apologetic smile. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I've treated you. I didn't realize. Angela nodded, accepting the apology but unsure of what to say in response. Before she could muster a reply, an announcement came over the hospital's PA system. All staff members are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory. When Angela arrived at the auditorium, it was already packed with staff, the air thick with anticipation and anxiety. She found a seat near the back, acutely aware of the curious glances and hushed whispers that followed her every move. At the front of the room, Mr. Edwards, now dressed in a sharp suit despite the casts on his arms, was deep in conversation with the hospital administrator and several other official-looking individuals. As the room gradually quieted, Mr. Edwards stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding immediate attention. The whispers and rustling of papers died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence as everyone waited to hear what he had to say. "Good morning," he began, his voice resonating with a commanding presence. "For those of you who may not know me, I am Thomas Edwards, the Chief Executive Officer of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I have been here at St. Mary's Hospital as a patient, recuperating from a skiing accident. This time has granted me the rare opportunity to closely observe the daily operations and the underlying culture of this institution." He paused briefly, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "What I have observed has been profoundly troubling. I have witnessed a troubling culture of discrimination, bias, and unprofessional behavior, issues that have no place in contemporary healthcare." A murmur of concern rippled through the audience. Some staff members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in somber agreement. "Let me be unequivocally clear, Mr. Edwards continued, his tone firm. "The incidents I have seen, particularly the treatment of Nurse Angela Parker, are not isolated events. They are indicative of a systemic problem that has been allowed to persist unchecked for far too long." Angela felt the collective gaze of her colleagues settle upon her. Sitting upright, she met their eyes with a calm and dignified demeanor. Mr. Edwards proceeded to outline the sweeping changes that would be enacted immediately: a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for every member of the staff, and a thorough overhaul of the hospital's hiring and promotion processes. Moreover, Mr. Edwards' voice grew steely as he added, "Those found guilty of discriminatory behavior will face stringent consequences. This includes Dr. William Greaves, who has been suspended while a full investigation into his conduct is conducted." The mention of Dr. Greaves' suspension sparked a fresh wave of whispers throughout the room. Angela noticed some of Dr. Greaves' longtime supporters displaying shock and anger, while others appeared relieved. "I understand that these changes may be challenging for some of you," Mr. Edwards continued, "but let me be clear, this is not merely about addressing moral concerns. It is about ensuring that we provide the highest quality of care for our patients. A diverse, inclusive, and respectful work environment is essential for achieving better outcomes for everyone involved." As Mr. Edwards concluded his address, he made a final, surprising announcement that caused a stir in the room. "Lastly, I am pleased to introduce the individual who will be spearheading many of these transformative changes, Nurse Angela Parker. She has agreed to take on the role of Chief Diversity Officer here at St. Mary's. Her wealth of experience and insights will be crucial as we work to reshape this institution." Angela was taken aback by the unexpected announcement, her feelings a whirlwind of shock, pride, and nervousness as applause erupted around her. She had only discussed joining the Diversity and Inclusion Committee with Mr. Edwards, not this elevated role. As she made her way to the front of the room at his gesture, she noticed a spectrum of emotions on her colleagues' faces: surprise, respect, and in some cases, residual resentment. Standing at the podium, Angela gathered her composure and addressed the room with resolve. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. To everyone here, I want to say this: I stand before you not as an adversary, but as a colleague who is deeply committed to the potential of St. Mary's and everyone who works here. The path ahead will undoubtedly be challenging, but I am dedicated to working collaboratively with each of you to foster an environment where every staff member feels appreciated and every patient receives the utmost care, irrespective of their background." As Angela spoke, she observed the impact of her words. Some staff members nodded in agreement, while others appeared contemplative. Even those who had previously been openly antagonistic seemed to be listening with newfound attentiveness. Following the meeting, Angela found herself surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations, apologies, and in some cases, tentative gestures of reconciliation. The atmosphere within the hospital had noticeably shifted. While tension and uncertainty remained, there was also a tangible sense of hope and renewed possibility. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As the day progressed, Angela found herself deeply engrossed in the monumental task of implementing the promised changes at St. Mary's. The work was both physically and emotionally demanding as she collaborated closely with Mr. Edwards and the hospital administration. Together, they began the intricate process of setting new policies into motion, revising protocols, and engaging with staff to foster an environment of inclusivity and respect. Despite the exhaustion that came with the long hours and intense focus, Angela felt a surge of exhilaration. For the first time since joining St. Mary's, she sensed that her efforts were genuinely making a difference and contributing to a meaningful transformation within the hospital. As evening drew near, Angela prepared to leave the hospital. She was about to step out when she noticed Mr. Edwards waiting for her near the exit. His presence was a comforting sight amid the whirlwind of the day's events. "Nurse Parker," he said warmly, his smile a beacon of encouragement. "Or should I now call you Chief Diversity Officer Parker? How are you managing with everything?" Angela let out a weary but relieved laugh. "It's been quite an intense day, Mr. Edwards. I'm still trying to process all that's happened." Mr. Edwards nodded with empathy. "I understand that it's a lot to take in all at once. But I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your ability to lead changes. Your resilience and integrity, especially in the face of such adversity, are precisely what St. Mary's needs right now." As they walked together towards the hospital's exit, Mr. Edwards' demeanor grew more serious. "You should be aware that what's happening here at St. Mary's is just the beginning. I plan to extend these changes across all of Healthcare United's facilities. Your story, Angela, has the potential to ignite a significant shift in how we approach diversity and inclusion in the healthcare sector." Angela felt the weight of this significant responsibility settles on her shoulders. Rather than feeling overwhelmed, she felt a deep sense of empowerment. "I'm ready for the challenge, Mr. Edwards. Together we can create real, lasting change." As they parted ways, Angela took a moment to reflect on the rapid changes she had experienced. From a place of isolation and near despair, she now stood at the forefront of a movement poised to transform not only St. Mary's but the entire healthcare industry. The journey ahead promised to be challenging, marked by obstacles and resistance from those opposed to change. Yet, as Angela looked back at the hospital, she was filled with a renewed sense of determination. This was more than a job, it was a calling. It was her chance to ensure that no other healthcare professional would have to endure the same struggle she had faced. With a renewed sense of purpose, Angela ventured into the evening, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The transformation of St. Mary's had begun, marking the start of a new chapter in the ongoing battle for equality and inclusion in healthcare. In the months that followed Mr. Edwards' pivotal intervention, St. Mary's General Hospital underwent a profound transformation under Angela's leadership as Chief Diversity Officer. With Mr. Edwards' steadfast support, the hospital's previously toxic culture began to evolve into one of inclusivity and mutual respect. The mandatory diversity and inclusion training sessions, initially met with resistance and skepticism from some staff members, gradually succeeded in broadening perspectives and changing attitudes. Dr. Greaves, who had been the subject of a thorough investigation, was dismissed from his position, sending an unequivocal message that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. As the changes at St. Mary's gained wider attention, Angela found herself in increasing demand as a speaker at medical conferences and diversity seminars. 1 year after Mr. Edwards' transformative intervention, she stood before a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference. A year ago, Angela began, "I was a nurse on the brink of giving up. Today, I stand before you as living proof that change is not only possible but achievable, and that one determined voice can indeed make a difference." She recounted the story of St. Mary's transformation, openly discussing the challenges they had faced while also celebrating the victories lives touched, minds changed, and the cultural shifts that had taken place. After the conference, Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered from his skiing accident, approached Angela with a look of pride and admiration. "Angela," he greeted her warmly, "you've come a long way from the nurse I met a year ago." They discussed the progress made at St. Mary's and its ripple effects across the healthcare industry. Mr. Edwards shared that several other hospitals within the Healthcare United network had begun to implement similar diversity and inclusion programs. "You know, Angela," Mr. Edwards said thoughtfully, "when I checked into St. Mary's after my accident, I never could have imagined the profound journey it would set in motion. You've not only transformed St. Mary's but reignited my passion for this work." As Angela prepared to return to St. Mary's, she reflected on her incredible journey from an isolated and frustrated nurse to a leader and catalyst for change. The journey had been arduous, but she had achieved so much. Although the work was far from over, Angela felt a profound sense of hope and determination stronger than ever before. Upon her return to St. Mary's, Angela was greeted by Sarah, who had once been a distant and unapproachable colleague but had now become a strong ally. The hospital buzzed with a new and vibrant energy, with staff members engaging in collaboration and communication in ways they had never done before. In the main lobby, Angela paused to admire a new mural depicting a diverse group of healthcare professionals working together in harmony. Below it, a plaque read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." As she settled into her office, ready to tackle new challenges, Angela smiled with satisfaction. The transformation of St. Mary's was just the beginning. The real work of changing hearts, minds, and entire systems was ongoing, and she was prepared to embrace it all, fully committed to advocating for a truly inclusive healthcare system, one day at a time. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. We've delved into a range of thought-provoking topics, from the challenges of staying relevant as we age to the profound struggles faced by individuals like Angela Parker in confronting and overcoming institutional prejudice. Each story and theme we've explored provides valuable insights into our own lives and communities. I'd love to hear from you. What's one thing you've learned from today's content that you plan to bring into your own life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment, like, share, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Your support helps us continue to create and share stories that matter. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.